When we were casting Terminator and we found Arnold Schwarzenegger, we were going to start shooting in summer of 1983, and we were going to shoot in Toronto. However, Dino De Laurentiis had a preemptive option on Arnold to star in Conan 2: The Destroyer. He'd already made the big hit Conan the Barbarian, and he preempted Arnold to star in that film, which meant that we couldn't start shooting for about 9 months. Now, that wasn't enough time to do another movie, but it was enough time for Jim to take on a writing assignment. By the time we started shooting, however, he'd written about 90 pages, and he was still in the second act, and it wasn't a completed script. However, the people at Fox read it and loved it and said, you know what, we're going to do the unthinkable. We're going to wait. We're going to wait until you're available to finish the script. And if your directing debut is, well, it really wasn't a debut in that he'd already directed Prawn to the Spawning, but if this film turns out well and you demonstrate talent in the directing field, we'll also let you direct. I'm not sure they were telling us the truth at the time, but we chose to believe it. We were naive, and I think that in Hollywood, when you're starting out, it helps to be naive and idealistic and believe that people are telling you the truth. And in this case, it turned out to be something that came to pass. If Terminator hadn't been such a success when it premiered, I doubt that Jim would have been brought on to direct. From the time we thought about tackling it, Jim's perception was, we're doing a sequel, we're not doing a remake. We're not trying to do a gothic horror film, we're going to do a combat movie. And that was how we perceived being respectful of the original vision of Ridley Scott and not trying to remake it. Sigourney was wary. She wondered, who are these kids who want to make the sequel to a film that she was rightfully very proud of. But from the first meeting, when Jim told her the direction he wanted to pursue, she was interested. Then there became a contract negotiation in which Fox was not necessarily willing to pay her the amount of money that she wanted, and asked Jim to pursue a storyline that did not include the Ripley character, which he balked at. He refused to do that version. Ultimately, a deal was done, and we were able to make the movie we all wanted to make, as opposed to one that was, we felt, simply a rip-off rather than a part of what has become, obviously, a very successful series. The great thing about this film is that we actually had enough money to bring in outside consultants, which had not been the case in the films we'd done for Roger Corman or Jim's, or even with the Terminator. And we were always huge fans of two people who were very, very different in their design concept. Sid Mead, who's truly a visionary, and he was able to imagine things that might not necessarily ever work, but looked bitchin'. Ron Cobb comes from a production design background, and his philosophy was, not only am I going to design it, but I'm going to tell you exactly how you can make this work. We shot at the Acton Power Plant, which was a decommissioned coal-generating plant within London. And that was pretty difficult. We found it was a perfect location. We had to spend a great deal of money with asbestos mitigation to make sure that it was safe for us to film in. And by the time we were done with it, we had to take readings of the air quality in there multiple times a day. And we found out that it was actually healthier there after we'd mitigated it than it was in the sound stages at Pinewood Studios. I was involved in the casting process from the very beginning because we had to meet everyone who was part of the North American Registry for the British Actors' Equity, as well as anyone who believed that they could do a passable American accent. I think we probably went through 3,000 people before we could even consider bringing anyone over from the United States. Obviously, Sigourney, because she was reprising her role as Ripley, that was one thing, but anyone beyond that we had to test or eliminate. Carrie Henn was part of an enormous search to find the character of Newt. Sarah Jackson went everywhere and auditioned kids at schools, and it was difficult, especially to find a little girl who could do anything that would sound like an American accent. Carrie had no acting experience. Her father was stationed at RAF Lakenheath. He was an American, mother's English, and she had never even acted in a school play before. We found that the children who had a great deal of acting experience had mostly acted in commercials, and whenever they delivered a line, they'd smile at the end. And it was so inappropriate for this girl who's really suffering from traumatic stress to smile every time she delivered a line. And Carrie had none of that conditioning, so she was perfect. It was weeks and weeks of meeting with everyone. And we found quite a few of the cast members in England, and there were just a few that we couldn't find. And that's how we ended up bringing people that we had worked with before over to co-star in the film. Adrian Biddle was not our initial director of photography, and at the time he hadn't been the DP of a feature film. He came from Ridley Scott and Tony Scott's commercial production company in England, and he'd done a lot of Ridley's commercials. And this was his first feature film, and he stepped in a few weeks into principal photography, and he was perfect casting from the very beginning, and really never missed a beat, was able to get inside Jim's head and give Jim exactly what he wanted, which our first DP did not feel comfortable doing. Who since passed away, was a tremendous director of photography, but he was a lighting cameraman in the traditional English lighting cameraman tradition, which is to say that he didn't want to hear what the director's vision was. He felt that he would read the script, see the set, and light it the way he wanted it. There's a scene when they're going into the atmosphere processing station, and Jim really wanted it lit by the miners' lights. And, he wanted it to be spooky, and he didn't want to be able to see all the details. And Dick lit it. It was side lit. It was bright. It did not feel at all as if it was being lit by the lights in the helmets, and it completely destroyed the vision that Jim had for that sequence. And I remember at the time thinking, oh no, this isn't going to work. Jim is really an auteur director, and he had a vision of how it should be lit, and not only that, but Jim is a cameraman. I remember having to say to him, this is Jim's movie, this is Jim's vision, and he said, well, if that's the case, if I can't do my job, which is to light it the way I want it, you better find someone else. And we did. Now, I pride myself on having a really great safety record. I don't believe that any movie is worth a serious injury, and it's, after all, we're only making a movie. This isn't real life. And I tend to be incredibly cautious. People may say too cautious, but the armored personnel carrier was actually an aircraft towing vehicle that we outfitted with the metal cover to make it look like an armored personnel carrier. But it was a towing vehicle for 747s. You can imagine how powerful that is for a vehicle that small to pull a 747. And at one point, we had the cameras set up right in front of the wall of the power station. And we wanted the longest drive up possible so that we could, have the APC coming directly toward camera. And I remember, I think at the last minute, we decided, let's remotely operate these cameras. Let's, set them and get the cameramen out of the way. And it turned out that the brakes failed and took out the cameras, and thank God there were no camera people there. No fear, especially in the scene when the alien rises up. And she was completely convincing. We also wanted to make sure that psychologically, considering this is a pretty dark and scary movie, we didn't have CGI characters that were added in later on. I mean, she was in there in pretty terrifying situations. We had long discussions with her parents and with her about whether or not she would in any way be traumatized by the experience. And she was perfectly fine, and she realized it was all make-believe. And he actually hadn't finished all of the cues for our film when we were sitting there with the London Symphony Orchestra. And we realized that, I think the cue was 12M12, but it was the final cue of the film. We were going through all of the cues, and we realized it hadn't been written. And of course, I think anyone would be a little stressed to find out that the climactic cue of the film didn't exist yet. Jim knew from the very beginning that he wanted to use rear projection, and that we couldn't afford a great deal of blue screen work. Jim and I would talk about which shots we would hold off to do with a reduced unit for visual effects photography. And, the atmosphere processing station was an obvious example of shots that were far better suited for that than for principal photography, because, when we were shooting in Acton Lane Power Station, you couldn't go very high because then it was revealed for exactly what it was. So whenever we needed any kind of height, elevators, things like that, anything that you needed to see, height that we couldn't get in Acton Lane, those all became our rear projection shots or miniatures.
It started when I first met Jim, when he was working as a model builder on Battle Beyond the Stars, and I was the assistant production manager. I, of course, assumed he was the head of the model shop. It turned out he was just a model builder, but he acted like he was the head of the model shop. He had that kind of authority. Making Battle Beyond the Stars, we needed someone to step in as art director. And overnight, Jim went from model builder to art director. We worked really closely together and decided that in the future we wanted to collaborate. He'd direct and I would produce. When he was in post-production in Rome on Piranha 2, he called me one morning and said in a fever dream he had this vision. We decided that we would collaborate on the film and bring it to the screen. We were turned down by every major studio. However, we did have one connection to Orion Pictures. Barbara Boyle and Francis Dole, who had worked for Roger Corman at New World Pictures, were both employed by Mike Medavoy. And we slipped the script to them, and they loved it. Jim Cameron had worked with Lance Henriksen on Piranha 2, and he very much wanted Lance to play the Terminator. He saw the Terminator initially as someone who would really blend in. And I remember Lance actually came in full makeup to meet with John Daly at one point. Clearly, when we went with someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger, that was very different. And we had Lance in the film, and instead he played a police detective as opposed to the Terminator. It created the idea of this unstoppable Terminator, and you didn't need to believe initially that there was metal under that body. The body was enough to convince people that he was lethal. It really didn't hurt the credibility of the Terminator, which was great. We weren't sure at the beginning whether going in that direction would be successful, and as it turned out, it was really the right choice. Arnold was cast first. With Arnold, we essentially had a go picture. And then we could concentrate on filling the other parts with the best people for the roles and not necessarily star names. Saint Sebastian in a film, and he was much more internal and much less of the kind of action icon that you would expect for someone auditioning for the role of Reese, who is the action hero in the picture. There was something very vulnerable about him, and that was incredibly important, that he not only be an action star, but he have the vulnerability. And that's why we went with Michael, because he ultimately combined those two skills, the skill to be incredibly physical and believable in that part, as well as the emotional connection that he had with Sarah. When we met Linda, she also had the ability to transcend the genre and not be someone who simply screams really well, but someone who was believable as the girl next door, who could ultimately become the mother who saves humanity. And that's not an easy transition. One of the other essential people that we were told we had to get in order for the film to be green-lit was someone who ultimately didn't work on the movie at all. We were told we had to get Dick Smith, who was the character makeup star at the time. And he was the one who agreed to talk with us, read the script, and then said, you know, I'm not the right guy for this. The right guy for this is Stan Winston. And he went to bat for Stan, as well as for the movie, to make sure that Stan was approved to come on board to head up the special effects. With Fantasy 2, they also came on board early enough on that they could contribute tremendously to how we planned to bring each effect to the screen. They were able to use the storyboards to say, okay, we're going to do this live on the set, we're going to do this following frame through stop motion animation, and that's part of the reason why the shots are so seamless regardless of the technique that we used. Initially, we were supposed to film in the summer of 1983, and we were going to film in Toronto, Canada. Unfortunately, Dino De Laurentiis decided to preempt Arnold to star in the sequel to Conan the Barbarian, and we had to shift our shooting schedule to spring, March 1984 in Los Angeles. Arnold was so essential to making this film that everyone was willing and quite happy to put the film on hold until March. If it had been another cast person who wasn't as essential to the identity of the film, I don't think we would have waited. The one nice thing about having a 9-month delay is that we had a soft prep for those 9 months. We were able to anticipate most of the production problems we encountered. Jim was able to storyboard almost the entire movie himself and created certain panels in color that he could pass out to the department heads so they had a perfect idea of the visuals Jim planned to get on screen. On a day-to-day basis, I couldn't worry about how the movie was going to turn out. I had to make sure we got the shots we needed, that the compromises that we had to make during production weren't so great that they compromised the picture as a whole. I was an advocate not only for Jim, but for the movie.
We did the first Terminator for I think, you know, the cost of your motorhome on the second film. Or your oatmeal budget.
Exactly.
Right before we started shooting, Linda Hamilton broke her ankle, and we were concerned and that she'd be able to actually carry out the performance that was essential. She had to run throughout the movie, and it was mostly Linda, by the way, on a broken ankle that had to be wrapped every day, and we had to completely shift the shooting schedule so that most of the running scenes took place later on. And that always throws a production into disarray when you change the schedule as much as we had to. The underground nightclub, disco, we called it Tech Noir because we felt that if we were going to get any good reviews at all, it might be good to spark critics' interest in the kind of filmmaking that we were doing, that it was, as opposed to film noir, tech noir, the dark side of technology. And that's what we called the nightclub in the film. And we shot it downtown in a place that had been a restaurant. And the great thing about it was that it seemed so realistic that people tried to pay to get in the night after we wrapped. We were so desperate for cash at that point, we almost took their money. But better sense got a hold of us, and we declined the paying patrons. Because you can't get Arnold down. Arnold is always up. And regardless of how difficult a day we were having, Arnold would play a practical joke or say something that would make us all laugh uproariously. And that keeps the morale on the set really high. When we initially met with Stan, we felt that it might not be possible to get away with as much during principal photography as we ultimately were able to capture on film at that time. And with Stan's ability to see the movie from beginning to end and to mind meld with Jim in terms of the storyboards for each sequence, we realized that we could actually do a lot during production, but we had to be able to know in advance what those sequences would entail. We were lucky that we had both trained under Roger Corman, and Roger taught us some very important lessons, and one of those was that oftentimes films are made in post-production. And we headed into filming knowing that we wouldn't know all the things that were missing until we'd had an opportunity to cut the film together. And we set aside money for that photography. We were doubly blessed in that Lindsley Parsons, who was the head of the LA branch of Film Finances, a completion bond company, believed in us as well. And when there was a lot of pressure on us to take that money out, because of course no one plans on not getting all the shots that are essential in production, no one has the luxury of having additional photography later on, he believed that was the smartest way to approach this film, and he supported us every step of the way. We did everything you can imagine in terms of guerrilla filmmaking to pull the movie off. There was one point where we wanted to see that the Terminator was outside Sarah and Ginger's apartment, and we didn't have that shot. So we went up to the house where I lived, and we spray painted the doors black to match the color of the sliding glass door in their apartment. And we didn't have the shoes anymore, so we spray painted the shoes just to get that one shot. We were naive enough at that point not to realize it was an impossible dream, and I think because of that naivete we were able to actually pull it off. So in the desert, we needed to film the establishing shot. Linda wasn't available, so we got my secretary assistant, Polly Apostoloff, my mother's dog. We actually were able to get the Jeep, and we went out there with Gene Warren, Jim, myself. We literally went out to a location.
It was out in the middle of nowhere.
We were setting up all day for the right light. Not one car had driven by. The entire time we were setting up.
We're 5 minutes away from shooting.
And we literally had the tripod just a few feet into the pavement.
I have Polly drive the Jeep on out and drive away.
And just as we were about to roll,
a little dot of a car starts to show up, and Jim says, wouldn't you know, it's probably a cop.
A cop car pulls up. And we were completely unprepared.
We didn't have a permit or anything.
We weren't supposed to be there.
And he pulls up, and what are you folks doing? And
excuse me, you're going to have to move your equipment off the road, and by the way, where's your film permit? A UCLA student film, and we just needed one shot, and then we would get out of there.
And I just stood in the background, smiled, gave him a little, you know.
And the highway patrolman thought, well, a little thing like this and helping out your son do a film, it's fine. He understood film school and all of that.
The policeman was very cooperative and said, okay, he would go hold traffic, which of course was not a problem because he was the only car that drove by there the entire day. And that was actually the last shot of the film. We made quite a few samples for possible composers for the film. And needless to say, when you come to music, that's where you literally have no money left. Brad really got the idea that this needed to have a percussive driving beat to go with the action of the film. He was great because he had no time, he had no money, and we were adding shots all the time in post-production as we'd get them in. And it didn't faze him a bit. Initially, the studio perceived it as a down and dirty action exploitation film.
Like a Charles Bronson film, 1 week in and out.
After, let's say, the negative word of mouth.
I made the statement that as a science fiction film, we should sell it on its own merits because that's a very particular audience. He said, this is not a science fiction film. I was dumbfounded. I said, yeah, it is. He said, no, it's not. I said, it's a science fiction film. He said, you can't sell this as a science fiction film. Star Wars is science fiction. If you promise that, people are going to feel betrayed if they go into a theater and you're telling them it's science fiction and it's this. I said, well, it does involve time travel and robots, two of the biggest mainstays of science fiction. All science fiction films aren't necessarily about space travel. He didn't get it.
When we began to believe we had something was the very first screening. And our very first advocate was, once again, Lindsley Parsons from Film Finances, who came to us and said, this is a really good movie. You guys have put something on screen here that is not only a good action movie, but it's an important action movie. There's no way when you're making your first film that you have any objectivity at all about what you've captured. And then we showed the film to the actors' agents. And both Ed L'Amato, who represented Michael Biehn, he saw the movie and he got it, as did Lou Pitt, who represented Arnold Schwarzenegger. They got it, and they are the ones who insisted that Orion screen the film for critics. And we started getting the response that Jim and I realized that we had touched a nerve, that the film was not being perceived as just a down and dirty exploitation film, but a film that actually had something to say that connected not only with audiences, but with critics as well. It was impossible to anticipate that the film would get the kind of almost universal positive reviews that we got, and that the film would open up and maintain the same box office week in and week out for a number of weeks. Part of it was timing, part of it was that we really did deliver a good film, and a film that at the time became part of the whole zeitgeist of America in 1984.